For years, debates have raged over the effectiveness of U.S. policy towards Myanmar and whether another approach might be more effective in pushing the current regime to adopt democratic reforms, such as holding free and fair elections and releasing more than 2,000 political prisoners. To discuss these and other issues, we're joined today by David Steinberg of Georgetown University. Professor Steinberg has studied and written extensively about Myanmar for many, many years. Thank you for joining us today, Professor.
My pleasure, sir.
Now, as we just saw in the preceding story, Aung San Suu Kyi has been released from house arrest and she's now meeting with supporters and government officials. What do you see in terms of her future? What role do you think she might play in Myanmar politics?
She was released about a week after the election. The government was afraid that she would, quote, interfere with the elections. The elections were held in November, and since then, as you say, she has been meeting with people. Her role will depend upon how far the government is able to go with their reform process. They have started some, but there are plenty of people within the power structure, controlled by the military, who do not want to see reform. So we have the reformists and the non-reformists, if you will. And if the reformists have their way, the chances of her doing something will be greater. We don't know the result of this sort of debate at the present time.
Do you see any possibility that the government might retract her freedom going forward?
If she overextends herself in the political sense, they are worried about her. There's no question about that. But so far she has been more careful than she's ever been before when she's been released. The other time she has tested the limits of her freedom. This time she has been more circumspect.
Now, the government has been making at least some initial overtures in terms of collaborating with her. Do you feel like that's something that's genuine, or do you feel like it's basically sort of a political ploy?
Well, power is with the military in civilian form, and there's no question that will continue. I think certain elements of that government are interested in alleviating the problems of Aung San Suu Kyi as they see it, because they know that her freedom, her role will help them internationally with the United States and with the European Union, those two elements most importantly. But at the same time, as I say, there is a certain tension in the country about how far these reforms will go, so that affects her role as well.
Now, there's been a lot of talk about U.S. policy towards Myanmar. Could you briefly characterize the policy and whether you believe it's been effective?
The policy from the beginning of this administration, since '88 and especially since '90, when they held an election and the opposition won, but it was not allowed. The policy has been regime change. That has been a specific U.S. policy. In other words, get out of power and then we'll talk to you. That was a non sequitur, of course. Right. Aung San Suu Kyi has been a very important element of our policy. She, in fact, makes that policy indirectly. In other words, what we believe she wants is the critical focal point of what we do in terms of policy.
She's very influential in determining U.S. policy.
She's very influential. Until January 2010, she was mentioned 1,598 times in the congressional record.
That's a lot of time.
It is. That means that she is a part of the internal American political process. Now, since the Obama administration came in, there's been a change in policy. We don't talk about regime change anymore, but we talk about constructive engagement, which means keeping the sanctions and having dialogue at a high level. And that's positive.
Now, a lot of human rights groups have been advocating for the Obama administration to take a harder line and to increase sanctions. But you've been an outspoken critic of sanctions. You don't believe they work. Why not?
I was against sanctions before they were formally instituted in the Congress, simply because I knew that these people would not give in to the U.S. This is a highly nationalistic country, and they cannot be seen to be given in to the U.S. under U.S. pressure. So the sanctions weren't going to achieve our goal. Sanctions are a tactic. They're not an end. And so the end was, of course, as I said, regime change. So it hasn't been effective at all. People say, well, South Africa is an example where sanctions worked. Of course, Cuba is a place where sanctions haven't worked. But in South Africa, all the countries around South Africa were in favor of sanctions. The regime, the economy, the leadership was all geared to Western Europe. None of the above apply. The only analogy is two brave Nobel Peace Prize winners, Aung San Suu Kyi and Nelson Mandela. And that is not sufficient to use that as an example. So I'm afraid that it hasn't worked at all.
So you don't see the government's decision to give Aung San Suu Kyi more freedom as a validation of current U.S. policy? You don't think they're intertwined with each other?
No, I don't think that has any relationship. Remember that she is the icon of democracy to the outside world. I mean, she is important in that country partly because of herself, and partly because she is the daughter of basically the founder of Burmese independence, sort of George Washington's daughter, if you will, in the American context. And she has an important role in that country, and she's done a remarkable job on her own. But at the same time, we, the outside world, or the Western world, looks to Burma, and we look upon it as, in terms of Aung San Suu Kyi. And I think we need to look at it more broadly, in strategic terms, economic terms, human rights, and democracy as well.
So if sanctions don't work, what do you see as being a more constructive and effective path forward?
I think the Obama administration has tried that. But the path forward means that we must give concessions and they must give concessions. But politically in the United States cannot get rid of sanctions until the Burmese government does something significant, like releasing those political prisoners that we talked about. They have released a few. It's been inconsequential. They need to do much more because they can operate in their country on the basis of their power structure. We need a consensual congressional approach. The Obama administration was weakened by the November 2010 elections here and cannot really fight with Congress over Burma. Burma, as I wrote once, is a boutique issue. It's important to some, but it is not related to the really important issues in Asia, North Korea, China, the renminbi value. I mean, Vice President Biden is in China now, South China Sea, and of course South Asia. Those are really critical issues for the U.S. So Burma is a secondary issue, if you will. And so therefore they're not about to use up any political ammunition internally in the U.S. for that purpose.
Okay. Professor Steinberg, thank you for joining us today. Your insights have been extremely valuable.
Thank you, sir.
Have a good day. That was David Steinberg of Georgetown University. He's an expert on Asia.
Link TV is the only U.S. network dedicated to global and national news, uncompromising documentaries, and diverse cultural programs. Programs which connect you to the world. To learn more, visit linktv.org.